are some of the positive aspects that has been able to sustain themselves despite the vicissitudes of the Biden administration?
So thanks for having me, Sarah. Thanks to EMET, the organization, and the wonderful work that you do. It's great to be with you and everyone joining us today to talk about the Abraham Accords and commemorate the 2-year anniversary. And so to your direct question, I think we've seen an enormous amount of progress in the past 2 years. Mindful that there are many, I think, that doubted whether or not the Accords would endure and that they would survive the stress that inevitably comes in a very complicated part of the world. Nonetheless, I think that even the casual observer would have to admit that this is a growing concern and it's not likely to erode in the near term. I think as we look back at the last 2 years, we've seen Israel open diplomatic representative offices in each of the Accord countries, direct air routes and flights between Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Manama, Casablanca, and Marrakesh. Ministers and leading figures from all Accord countries have conducted reciprocal official visits. They've signed over 200 cooperative agreements and memorandums of understanding across the full spectrum of areas. Business people have obviously traveled broadly across the Accord member countries. Trade has expanded as a result. With the Emirates alone, it's up over 511%. The first 6 months of this year have exceeded all of the 12 months of the preceding year, and we judge there's more potential there. And expansion has occurred really across all of the Accord member countries. The security cooperation also has tied, and again, has increased. And our logic was if you could establish an economic relationship between these countries, each of which represents some of the most vibrant economies in the region and in the world, frankly, then that the security rationale would follow, that they would defend and protect that interest. And all of their visions were dependent upon cooperation with each other and integration into global markets. And I think that we're seeing a recognition of that, and that vision is being enacted on a regular basis. And I would add too that that in our judgment, the potential is far greater than even the progress we've seen over these past 2 years. And that integration and cooperation between the Accords member countries is a critical part of it. And further, we believe, and I'm sure we'll talk about today, that the Abraham Accords member countries can obviously work to their own benefit, but they can also offer partners and allies in different parts of the world, including the United States, significant advantage. And we're hopeful to translate that into material reality, and the Institute certainly, and all of our partners joining us today, hope to play a part in that.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think I read in one of the materials that you passed out that the projected trade between the United Arab Emirates and Israel is $4 billion for 2022. That is enormous. And, you know, it's also the to me, the great benefit of the Abraham Accords is that the old narrative of demonization of the other is eroding. They're getting to know one another through this trade, through travel, and I think you have to be together in order to accept one another and communicate. So it's amazing. However, we understand that many of the Gulf nations might have an erosion of respect for the United States through our rather feckless withdrawal from Kabul, and through the utter appeasement over the last 17 months of Iran. And some of the Gulf countries have begun to diversify their portfolio by actually going over to Tehran and meeting with Ebrahim Raisi. So can you talk a little bit about whether or not this momentum could be sustained, despite the fact that I feel that the halo that America had during the Trump administration has begun to tarnish over these last few years?
Sure. Well, certainly there's a number of stresses to the Accords and to the individual member countries in the region. You point to probably the most significant, and it's certainly the perspective of Accord member countries and the broad range of partners with whom we maintain close contact with is that the U.S. approach to the region, which has in many respects been based on its approach to Iran, both for ourselves in the Trump administration and for the current administration, and I would say for the preceding administration under President Obama, the approach towards Iran is sort of the prerequisite. It is the common ground, because as they all in Warsaw in 2019 at an event that Secretary Pompeo hosted, all countries that would later comprise the Abraham Accord nations and others agreed that the principal threat to peace and stability in the Middle East was Iran. And that reality has been present for quite some time. Recognizing it is critically important, and it's a predicate for additional cooperation. Certainly, we agreed with that proposition. We recognized the reality, we acted accordingly, and that enabled us to maintain a close working relationship with the countries and set the foundations in some respects for the Abraham Accords. I would say, too, that from the perspective of the countries now, the U.S. approach to the region, including Iran, is in contradiction. On the one hand, there is a strong desire to approach a détente and a diplomatic rapprochement with Iran on the nuclear file, but at the same time, a recognition that their support for terrorism, which is at epic proportions and has been for some time, continues unabated, as does their missile program and the human rights abuses. And so that destabilizing activity in the region is, by all accounts across the partner nations, viewed as problematic, to say the least. You can't feed the threat and at the same time then engage with partners and allies in the regions to address and meet that. And so in their minds, they see, one, there's a fear of the United States withdrawing from the region, and that has been, I think, a serious concern for some time, and not without reason. And second, I would say that any attempt to provide resources to, again, the principal threat to peace and stability in the region is going to cause a tremendous amount of concern. And if we're at the same time not supporting our partners and allies and providing them additional capabilities, particularly if we're reducing our own presence in the region, then we've left them in sort of a lurch. And that concern is hard to overestimate. And so they think that there is a contradiction in the U.S. approach to the region, and I think it's understandable why. And under those circumstances, they feel they have to make difficult choices. And one of those is to make their own way with Iran and attempt to establish dialogue, which they've always maintained to greater or lesser extents. But look, it's a threat to them economically. It's a threat to their peace and stability, to their sovereignty. And it's, again, difficult to overstate just how important that is to them. And if the United States is not there to support and sustain them and to secure them under that circumstance, they certainly don't want us providing resources to their adversary. As it pertains to the Accords, it will remain, I think, stress to all Accord member countries as they chart a path to deal with the Iranian threat, in their minds, again, without strong support from the United States. It's our hope that that will be rectified. There is, of course, the possibility that the agreement, which has been under debate and discussion now for some 2 years without substantial progress, there is a possibility, of course, that there is not a return to what would be the JCPOA minus or JCPOA 2.0. And in that case, there is perhaps an opportunity for the United States and Israel and our partners in the region, including the Accord member countries, to make an alteration in our approach to the region and perhaps support our partners in the Accords member countries more directly and address the Iranian threat more comprehensively. It's what they want. It's what I think a broad constituency in the United States want. And we're seeing increasing support for this in the United States Congress in particular.
Right, right. So do you believe that the erosion of support that many of our Sunni Gulf allies feel also translates to an erosion of the ties between these Gulf countries and Israel?
I think the possibility exists. I think it can serve as a constraint. It may discourage countries from expanding ties because there's risk associated with it. There was risk when they made the decision. And obviously, I think as everyone knows, we took steps to address that risk in a very concrete and substantial way, and some more visible than others. But I think that's important. And look, we did that in '79 and we did it in '94. with both Egypt and Jordan, and we continue to do so, and for good reason. And so I think at the end of the day, it could well serve as a constraint. Again, there is an opportunity, I think, to revisit it, to listen to our partners and allies who are in close proximity to this threat, and I think whose judgment is sound. And if we do, I think we have the opportunity to do what they would welcome the United States doing, which is supporting our partners more vigorously and allowing them to expand. As many in the region frequently point out, they can't take a more pro-Israel stance than the United States does. And so our lead matters, our position matters enormously. And if there's equivocation, if there's some hesitancy, if there's a lack of full support for Israel's position in the region, it's hard for other countries, including the Abraham Accord member countries, to stake out a more positive position. And that too constrains the progress between Accord member countries. But as we said up front, there still is progress. There still is a desire to strengthen and expand cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's about getting to full potential.
Right, right. One of the benefits that we were beginning to see was work on the Eastern Mediterranean gas pipeline, which is lovely. And we're seeing how dependent the world is for other sources of energy since Russia invaded Ukraine. However, we have a very, very big problem, and that's that Lebanon is basically a puppet state of Hezbollah, Iranian-backed Hezbollah. How stable do you think that kind of relationship is proving to be?
Well, for everyone that has interests in Lebanon, has friends in Lebanon, and has witnessed the very difficult situation that the country finds itself in now and what it once was. I think it's painful for all of us to watch. Mm-hmm. But I do think you're right, and that the reality is that at least since the Doha Agreement that really apportioned the different competing political parties and their constituencies proportionally represented in the government structure, we sort of baked in this flaw in the system that allowed Hezbollah to exert control politically, and has resulted, I think, in the circumstances we're now witnessing, which is a very painful and slow descent into the abyss. And I, as many others do, I think it doesn't need to be this way. It doesn't need to end this way. And for the people of Lebanon and for the region, I think we're hopeful, many of us are hopeful, that we can reverse course. Mm-hmm. I do think that it's going to be essential to limit Hezbollah's control over the state, which is definitely a parasitic relationship to which the state and the people do not clearly benefit. And at the same time, this has to be done carefully because of the security presence and because the threat to not only Lebanon's stability, but also to the region is at play. So this has to be carefully managed. It's not impossible to be done. The U.S. has a role to play in this without doubt, and so do our partners and allies, both in Europe and in the region. But it's difficult to see a clear path. The Eastern Mediterranean gas resources writ large, including those within the economic exclusion zone of Lebanon and other countries, is a critical component of not only Lebanon's future, but the region's future. It's also critically important, in our view, to the Europeans who are now looking rightfully for a replacement for Russian gas. And in our view, that's the logical place and a logical part of the solution. The physical infrastructure you mentioned, the East Med pipeline and the Poseidon pipeline, is another example of this. Euroconnect electricity connector would be another, where there are infrastructure plans in place. However, it requires a commitment from Europe, which I think now is plausible for them to become long-term customers. And in that case, the infrastructure investment then makes good business sense. But to our minds, I think the strategic realignment between our European partners and those in the Middle East, particularly the Abraham Accord member countries, has enormous potential. And that cooperation hopefully will provide a platform to resolve some of the deep-seated issues in Lebanon that are causing the economic and the political difficulties. But again, the political structure as it stands now was never a tenable position in the long term. And I think until that's addressed, the economic situation is not likely to improve. But it's our hope that it will. And it's our hope, frankly, that they'll join the Abraham Accords. And someday I think they will.
Yeah. So what do you believe the chances are of eventually Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords?
Well, first, more broadly, we'd love to see expansion of the Accords. Of course, we had a number of conversations with potential countries in the region and outside of the region that were very much interested in this. And again, because the economic and the broader benefits of relationship with Israel and with other Accord member countries is compelling. And it's our hope that expansion will occur. As specifically to Saudi Arabia's instance, I think it's certainly a key ingredient in their reaching their longer term goals is 2030 into 2050, from a cultural standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a security standpoint. And I think it's a matter of when, not if. However, I think the principal obstacle, the principal concern for the kingdom is its security. And again, we talked about Iran as the principal threat to that regional peace, stability, and security. And unless there is a concrete way to address it, it's difficult to see them taking the next steps. And again, someone's going to have to address that risk. And if it's not Israel, then it's going to have to be the United States, I think, logically. And I think they'd welcome it. Ultimately, I think it is, again, a matter of when and not if. And our jobs, I think, collectively are to prepare and to take the steps necessary to set conditions for what one day we hope will be a beautiful reunion.
Wonderful. And now it's about my time to turn the podium over to my wonderful colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who will read some of the questions that have come in and perhaps pose some of his own. Hussein?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Robert, for such a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for all our viewers who joined us today and who sent us questions. Please keep sending us your questions through the Q&A function through Zoom, and we will get to them as we filter through the questions. Robert, we received multiple questions asking you about the expansion of the Abraham Accords. You touched on this many times, but after the Abraham Accords, there was a constant talk that this is going to be expanding. There, as you said, there were talks about other countries joining this, but then kind of the momentum was almost lost. Nobody knows exactly, is it because the Biden administration has no more interest in continuing the efforts of the Abraham Accords, or that basically the potential exhausted itself? So we received a number of questions asking about this. What made this expansion never actually materialize?
Well, it's complex. I think from my perspective, there are a couple of factors. The first is the transition between presidential administrations in the United States is a complex process, and it takes time for a new team to get settled into their jobs, to evaluate circumstances, all the available information, and to make the policy decisions that guide and direct any administration in its approach, globally as well as to regions and to individual countries. I do think and take the administration at face value and at its word. And in my conversations with colleagues there in the current administration, there is an interest to pursue the Abraham Accords and normalization agreements with Israel. I think the Negev Summit and the Negev Forum recently in Bahrain and the working groups that are in the progress of being established are a material evidence of it. And we're hopeful, and we will support in every way that we can that process to formally bind these countries together and to seek opportunities collectively to expand the accords. It's not an easy thing. I would point out that, as I think most know, the accords for our purposes were accomplished within a 5-month period at the very end of a 4-year term. And the work that took place in the years preceding were critically important. So it may well be that it will take time for additional countries to join. Now, that said, I think there are a number of countries that I think are very interested in doing so. They've watched the progress being made. They've seen the benefits to the members currently, and they consider that those benefits could be accrued to them by joining. And so I think that strong incentive is there. And I think, too, our colleagues, not just in the United States, but our partners and allies in Europe and in Asia, also have a constructive role to play, encouraging countries to join. Part of that is to support and reinforce the decision of countries that already did. They should be rewarded for taking that bold step. And we all have a role to play, I think, in doing so. And second, we should all be encouraging others to join. In some cases, that could be full return or full diplomatic normalization. In some cases, it'll be incremental. beginning with economic cooperation, establishing trade offices, reciprocal flights, maritime deliveries of goods and services, financial transactions, a number of ways I think that evolution could occur. And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done. I think there's hope that there is every intent to do it. And the Accords member countries themselves are keen to see others join for all the reasons that they did. And so hopefully we won't have to wait too much longer before countries do. Hopefully before we're talking about the 3rd anniversary, we'll see concrete advancement in other countries join.
Thank you. Okay, now we have a question not about the expansion to new countries, but about other countries, basically the countries that already had peace with Israel, namely Egypt and Jordan. Can the Abraham Accords transform the cold, calculating relationship that Israel has with Egypt and Jordan? As we've seen, the Abraham Accords made so much progress within a very short span of time, way more than Egypt, the relationship with Egypt and Jordan was able to achieve in decades. Can the Abraham Accords help that change?
So I think we already are seeing a change. It's striking to see the trade increases between Egypt and Israel, as well as between Jordan and Israel. So I think the answer is absolutely. And I do think that's where some of the most significant potential is, because of the size and scope of the economies and because of the proximity. And one of the areas of emphasis for the Institute, along with a number of our partners, is to expand the capacity for overland trade. And we're looking at both borders in this case, and the infrastructure can easily be expanded. The economies, I think, require having additional connectivity, and allowing for it, I think, is going to be critically important. And there's, again, a desire to take advantage of it. And I think we've seen that very clearly from both Cairo and Amman. And I think in both cases, there's an opportunity to make progress on the Israel-Palestinian front as well, together as an Accords constellation. And this was always very much on our minds, and certainly the Accord member countries. So I think in the case of each individual country, no question, collectively, our view is the integration of economies is what's going to really give the scale and full potential of the Accords the ability to reach that. And second, or rather thirdly, I think it does also provide the opportunity, the unique opportunity, to make progress on otherwise a dormant front in the Israel-Palestinian question in particular. And so our hope is, and we're working towards achieving really all 3 of those objectives.
Thank you. Now, we received also a few questions about the issue of the NATO-like arrangement that was talked about, as you know, for a while in the region. How realistic it is to expect that there could be some sort of a NATO-type arrangement with all our Middle East allies?
That's a great question. And first, let me say that regardless of what it's called, a new enduring regional security architecture is absolutely, in my judgment, required in the Middle East. And I think there's broad agreement on the principle that cooperation between partners and allies in the region, particularly U.S. partners and allies in the region, is what's required. And look, we came to the same conclusion in Europe, which is why NATO was established. Again, the same logic holds. We have, unfortunately, for decades, episodically formed coalitions and agreements between countries to combat threats, from piracy to narcotics to terrorism to Saddam Hussein in Iraq and other examples, as you all know. And so our point, I think, was, and our point remains, that it is a valid principle, and it's also the most efficient way for the United States to work and support that, so that we don't have this have to have this massive security presence in the region, for which there's decreasing support politically across the aisle in both political parties in the United States. In our term, in our administration, our goal was to establish what we call the Middle East Strategic Alliance, which again, the idea is a new enduring regional security architecture. The point was that and normalization with Israel were intended to intersect at some point in the future. It just so happened that we made faster progress on normalization with Israel than we did on the new strategic alliance. We got very close to the end on it, even though Egypt eventually withdrew from the talks. We think there was strong indications that they would rejoin. But the other countries and the United States, we actually obtained final agreement on that, on the structure, the basic structure of it before we left office, but didn't have time to execute. Our hope is that the subsequent U.S. administrations, including the current one, will pursue this, and they've said as much. And our hope is that it happens. And the countries in the region, I think they really want this to happen. And one of the things they expect and really want from the United States is less so our physical presence of our own military forces in the region, but also the provision of capabilities. They are more than happy to purchase capabilities, and obviously they have, and they'd like to obtain additional resources. Those are sometimes difficult to obtain. Our point was it's much easier and more practical and more beneficial to provide those capabilities to our partners. And again, an enduring regional security architecture in the Middle East with Israel as a component of it, which is why the normalization efforts were intended to intersect at some point in the future. Obviously, it's the most significant U.S. investment and a very good one at that. And it should be obviously a core component of it. So I think the point is that it's required. There's strong support and desire for it. Now, the difficult part is what form it will take. But our hope is that progress will be made because, unfortunately, the range of threats is not decreasing, it's increasing.
Right. I'd like to interject here that one of the few pieces of legislation that we ardently support is the Defend Act of 2022, which looks at the emerging regional architecture that, Robert, I have to say you had a great deal to do with, and looks at the common threat of missiles and drones against both Israel and the Abraham Accords countries, plus Egypt and Jordan. And it's simply a feasibility study that the Department of Defense is doing and reporting to Congress. And essentially, at the end of it, there's a clause that I really like that says that those countries that are capable of contributing their fair share should. You know, I've long felt that Israel is in a position with, I think, the 12th largest economy in the world to contribute their fair share, you know, and certainly the Emirates can. So, you know, it shouldn't all be on the shoulders of the American taxpayer, I believe. Anyway, Hussein.
Thank you, Sarah. I just have a follow-up question, Robert, about this. Well, we've also heard statements from some Arab states distancing themselves from the possibility of a NATO alliance. I think the biggest name has been Jordan. The King of Jordan, for some reason, recently made statements that, no, this is actually not on the table and it's not going to happen anytime soon. Even a few Gulf countries also had similar statements. Why is this? If there is already, as you said, there was actual work on this, you got the final agreement of many of those states, why would then later publicly distance themselves from this arrangement?
It's a great question. So at the end of the day, I think the calculation made by Jordan and others was it really predicated on the U.S. commitment. The U.S. has to be committed to making this a reality. Absent that, it doesn't have the depth and the scope to address legitimate security concerns. But if the U.S. is invested, on the other hand, then I think you see a compelling reason for countries to participate. So in other words, if the decision is, I support this with the U.S. backing and all of the resources that come along with it, then it addresses the security concerns. But if the countries of the region are left to their own devices without significant support, then all they're doing is accepting additional risk without additional capability.
Right.
It's true that the integration between countries would offer additional utility in a way to meet that threat, but that takes time. The integration of these different militaries in a lot of different ways, including in the air defense spectrum where it's most acutely needed and where most of the discussion has thus far been constrained, requires a great deal of work in order to overcome some technical issues that would result in integration of systems mostly provided by the United States, again, to our partners and allies. And let me add one other thing that I mentioned before is that our efforts to, and our success in bringing Israel from, in the defense perspective, from the European command into the central command was integral to this, because up to this point, they were, for all kinds of different reasons, they were part of and addressed for the US military perspective as part of our European command. And that sort of separated them from the region. And it in many ways prevented their integration with their neighbors. And that obviously was addressed in our term and done deliberately so. And so it's a critically enabled factor. But again, for Jordan and for others, the U.S. commitment to this is critical. It's central. And so long as it's there, I think you'll see support for it. As long as it is not there, I think you'll see a lack of support for it.
Thank you. We also recently have seen a few Gulf countries reaching out to Iran. The UAE and Kuwait recently actually sent ambassadors for the first time in years to Tehran. The Saudis have been having their back channel talks with the Iranians at various diplomatic levels. Does this threaten the relationship between those Gulf countries or the Arab Gulf and Israel? Is this a form of hedging bets, given uncertainty about the United States and its effort to contain the Iranian threats?
So first, as you know, and I suspect many of those watching today, all of these countries have maintained some level of dialogue with each other under any circumstance, and always have. It's a critical component culturally, diplomatically. There will always be a conduit of a flow of information. Typically with adversaries, it's very carefully restricted. In this case, we're seeing a very public return to establish diplomatic ties. And I think that's for two reasons. First is the necessity. Under the current approach, they are being encouraged, and they view they have no other choice but to elevate the connectivity between countries to decrease misunderstanding and to prevent any escalation. I'll add that my judgment is they don't expect much of this, that they don't anticipate that there's going to be a radical positive result or any substantial change as a result of these ties, but they feel it's necessary. And in large measure because of the U.S. approach to Iran and the region, and because they're being encouraged. As we are pursuing a diplomatic rapprochement with Iran, they're being encouraged to do the same thing. They'd rather not. They'd rather, I think, see a different U.S. approach to the region, and that's what they've advocated for, and it's not hard to understand why. But so long as the approach is to seek that diplomatic rapprochement, which ultimately is unlikely to bear any fruit, they will pursue a similar path, which they know is unlikely to bear any fruit, but they think it's necessary to prevent, again, an escalation, which under the current circumstances, they think is more likely than not. And it is a cause of great concern to them.
Thank you. We received also a number of questions, of course, about the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority. We've read recently that Israel is concerned about the stability of the Palestinian Authority. The PA currently is in a bad shape. Is it possible for the Abraham Accords countries to help Israel or to help the Palestinians, whether get a new Palestinian leadership, stabilize the Palestinian Authority and help them reform themselves and have better relations with Israel? Or basically the Abraham Accords can't really affect the Palestinians in this way?
So for us, and I think for all the Accord member countries, this was intended to be a step in the right direction. It was to provide really an alternate path and additional resources to help address the legitimate concerns of the Palestinian people materially, just their quality of life. Second, it was at some point in the future to provide support for resolution of the political challenge. Now, they all recognize, though, that requires a representative government to advocate for the concerns, the legitimate concerns of the Palestinian people. And at some point in the future, I think that's likely to happen. I think it's almost certain to happen, especially as you consider the significant population, not just in the Palestinian demographic, but across the region. There's a massive youth bulge that ultimately, I think, will lead towards a political transition from one generation to the next. And perhaps in that shift, there'll be an opportunity. Until then, the Accords member countries can, I think, do a great deal to help ameliorate the political friction, but also to help on the economic front and to improve the quality of life for the Palestinian people. And it's their strong desire to do so. It's one of the reasons we established the Abraham Fund at the tail end, wherein Accord member countries would contribute, as well as the United States did through the Development Finance Corporation, to provide for infrastructure development projects to improve the checkpoint infrastructure, allowing Palestinian workers to get to their jobs and to move freely between the territories, which everyone recognizes as a problem. It's easily solved, but it does require an investment. And the fund was designed to undertake projects like that and to improve the transportation infrastructure to, again, allow for the more free movement of goods and services between the different territories in Israel and its neighbors. And our hope is that that will be resurrected at some point in some form, because all the Accord member countries are keen to see it happen. And Israel is frankly keen to see it happen. So our hope is that it will. And then more broadly, I think the Accord member countries are open to ideas and suggestions and are working on a number of initiatives in order. Some are old, resurrecting some old issues like desalinization for Gaza, and some are frankly new. In either case, I think they want to be helpful and can. There's one caveat, of course, is as the Accords were a recognition that we could, in fact, make progress between Israel and its Arab neighbors, even if we don't make progress on the Israel-Palestine front. The hazard works in reverse, that if we make political progress between Israel and Palestinians a prerequisite for progress more broadly, we're going to constrain progress more broadly. So we have to be, I think, prudent in how we proceed, but I think mindful that there are, in fact, opportunities.
Right, right. There's, of course, one major obstacle that we at AMET are always stressing, and I think such is the case still with Jordan and Egypt, and that is what they're being taught in their schools, including the UNRWA schools. And, I'd like to quote John F. Kennedy, who once said, peace doesn't just depend on signed documents and charters alone, but on what's in the hearts and minds of the people. And, if you constantly indoctrinate children that there is no Israel, talk about the virtues of martyrdom, it's horrific. It's really horrific. Demonize Jews in the state of Israel. So if there's a way, we have been working so hard throughout so many years to change the textbooks that America funds to a great deal through UNRWA, and there seems to be a lot of resistance there. So that's a big obstacle. Anyway, go ahead.
We received a question about Qatar. Qatar actually is one of the main mediators between Israel and the Islamic movement, Hamas, as we all know. And that means they do have actually to maintain a high level of connection and relations with Israel. Why was there ever a talk for Qatar to join the Abraham Accords at all? I mean, one would expect that they would want to.
Well, first, you're right in that we have collectively sought and obtained Doha's support for ameliorating and sometimes resolving the conflict between Israel and Hamas. I would say that increasingly we've seen Cairo become more and more constructive in this, and I think that is the right answer. And I think it's probably the preferred path to resolve the potential for conflict between the two sides. Our conversations with Doha were similar in that, we thought we had multiple avenues. We appreciated their efforts, and I think we'll continue to appreciate their efforts, but that their joining the Accords would be an even greater contribution to regional peace and stability. And again, this falls in the category of if the U.S. and more broadly other partners and allies, including Accord member countries, if I think we encourage Qatar and other countries in the region to normalize diplomatic relations with Israel, I think there's a good chance. If we don't encourage them to do so, then it may be that it doesn't happen in the near term. Our hope is that it'll be a matter of policy to encourage them to join. And I think in due course, I think the benefits will be very clear. And I think the enormous potential of the economic and the security cooperation dividends would be abundantly clear. But again, it comes down to, as a matter of policy, the U.S. playing a central role here. Is this something we're going to encourage, or is this something we're going to discourage? And our hope is that we'll encourage it. And I think they'll respond.
Do you believe the current administration is actually pursuing the enforcement of the Abraham Accords and the expansion with the same kind of strength of the will of the previous administration?
Well, it's a complex endeavor. I think obviously every administration's approach to the region has some differences. Certainly, there are some significant differences between approaches. We talked about Iran. Obviously, we had a very different approach on Iran, one in which we found common cause with Israel and our partners and allies in the region, which is, I think, fundamentally very important. Second, I think that relationship predicates and really drives the rest of your approach to the region, because how you deal with the principal threat to their peace and stability will determine the nature of cooperation on a range of other issues. Second, I do think that the current administration wants to pursue normalization of other countries with Israel. And again, as we discussed earlier with Sarah, I think the Negev Summit and the Negev Forum and working groups is their priority in doing so. And our hope is that it will yield dividends and it will yield fruit, and we're working to support it in every way that we can. And we all should, because I do think that it does help strengthen the bonds between countries, and I do think it will encourage others to join.
Thank you. And now this is the last question that we received. I want to thank all of our audience who participated with us. And the last question is about Iran. If this administration does rejoin a JCPOA or an Iranian deal, is this in any way going to adversely affect Israel's growing relations with the Arab countries?
So there's a huge risk associated with it. Frankly, whether or not the United States re-enters into any sort of agreement, which would look in its current form, as far as we know, not much like the JCPOA. And whatever your views of the JCPOA, I think it was broadly recognized that it did not encompass the full range of Iranian threats, which is why many, including I think the current administration, began pursuing the idea, at least, of a longer and stronger agreement, a solution which would encompass the range of Iranian threats. And regardless of whether or not a deal is reached, I think the threat looks markedly similar in both cases. They're incredibly close to develop a nuclear weapon. Many of the countries in the region assume that that is going to happen and are acting accordingly, which is intrinsically not helpful, but also in some ways unavoidable. And second, I think that they are all looking for U.S. leadership in this. And if they don't feel that the United States is addressing the full range of Iranian threats, then they judge that they're going to have to take steps in their own interest to provide for their own security. Now, the result of that historically has been mixed, to say the least. In many cases, it has not been positive, because each country pursuing a resolution to its own security threats, it basically produces an intrinsically unstable region. And so instead of cooperation, in some cases, you see the opposite. And so there is a strong possibility that the bonds between the Accord member countries will be severely tested by an Iran enabled by an enormous amount of material resources resulting from a new agreement, and possessing threats for which they cannot address by themselves. And so it is also likely, of course, that Iran will press its advantage and feel that there are no constraints or no deterrents to its terrorism and to its regional malign activities, which have already increased markedly in just the last couple of years. So there is a tremendous amount of concern. There's a tremendous amount of fear, frankly, about this. And there are a few solutions to the problem. And our hope, again, is that the Accords provide a bulwark against this instability and provide at least an example of what partnership and collaboration between U.S. partners and allies in the region could represent. And it provided the U.S., I think, continues to support that in strengthening and expanding ties, then I think it might withstand that pressure, and probably will. But it is going to be a difficult time because Iran will have, unfortunately, a tremendous amount of resources and latitude, unfortunately, to continue its activities in the region.
Thank you very much, Robert. Actually, if I may take a prerogative question, since we have a few minutes and we don't have any more questions from the audience. The Iranians, in their approach to their own Arab Gulf policy or GCC policy, they basically tried to provide themselves as an alternative to a relationship with the West, with the US and Israel, that they can provide a security structure for those GCC countries. Of course, they do it in kind of the mafia way, but basically that they're trying to offering them, relations with them as an alternative to an uncertain relationship with the United States, and that's kind of what they have been going for. Is there any possibility that GCC states might actually, or any of them, not all of them, so you have countries like Oman and Kuwait and Qatar with various levels of engagement with Iran. Is there any potential that any of them would actually choose closer relationships with Iran over a closer relationship with the United States?
So although there's a strong practical streak and a strong realist streak in the region, in this case, I think that you're looking at odds that would approach Central and Western Europe seeking a stronger relationship with Putin after the invasion of Ukraine. I think that the prospects of that are exceedingly small. And exceedingly small because I think no one in the region views them as a positive force or one with which they can enter into a security cooperation agreement of any kind. Will they have to potentially approach some sort of détente in which they have an understanding from an economic, again, because these are competing exporters of petroleum resources. So they're competitors minimally on an economic scale, and they're certainly competitors in the security space. But I don't think there's a strong desire in the region to do so. But I also think that they don't think that's a practical possibility, that there is any way in which Tehran would cease to threaten them internally or externally, and both are concerns to them, regardless of an agreement reached. I think they view that their objectives and goals are completely in opposition to one another, and I think they're right. And I don't think that they judge that there is a possibility of resolving those differences. I think they'll work as best they can to, again, obtain some sort of détente in which they don't directly threaten each other. But I don't think they even judge that that's likely to endure for very long, because historically it has not. Since 1979, it's been awkward at best, and it has been completely confrontational. And I think after what happened at Abqaiq in 2019, where you see direct Iranian attack against a neighbor's energy infrastructure, the message was very clear. The key question in all of this is, what will the United States do then and now? And I think that's going to be the question all of them are going to continue to ask. And our hope is that the U.S. will be committed to our partners in the region, and that we'll stand with them in opposition to our enemies. And if we do that, I think then we've got a good chance. But absent that, I think it's going to be a very bumpy ride.
Right, right. As Osama bin Laden said, if you see a strong horse and a weak horse, you will bet on the strong horse. And America has to be the strong horse. That's the work that made all of the Abraham Accord countries come together. America was invested in this. And you were heavily, heavily personally invested. You made God knows how many trips to the region when this was all going on. And you are really, truly one of America's unsung heroes, Robert. And it's a pleasure to have you. Please, please be sure to invest what you can to the AA Institute, peaceinstitute.org. That's aapeaceinstitute.org, and help support the wonderful work of Robert Greenway. And of course, you know, we are depending on you, our audience, for your contributions. If you like these webinars, please continue to support ametonline.org as well. Thank you so much, Robert.
Great pleasure to be with you today, Sarah, and appreciate the questions and all of your viewers, and look forward to hearing from you. It's going to take, I think, a broad constellation of those that are keenly interested in this issue to remain engaged. We all have a role to play, and I appreciate yours and your organization. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Robert.